Prime Minister may be half a world away, but even Washington couldn't provide Julia Gillard with respite from the carbon tax debate today. Tony Abbott took the fight into the manufacturing heartland of the Prime Minister's own electorate, arguing jobs would go. For its part, the government's blaming the opposition leader's relentless negative campaign for turning community sentiment against it. But political editor Chris Uhlmann argues that to a large extent, Labor's been the author of its own fate.
John Howard saw the climate change perfect storm brewing in October 2006.
Looking at the map, I mean, New South, it's terrible. You had the Stern report, you had very early bushfires in Victoria, you had the crunching grip of the drought.
That storm would help sweep him from office as another leader won the argument for the future.
He simply doesn't understand the new challenges that we face in the future, the challenges of climate change and water.
Kevin Rudd rode a wave of public sentiment that demanded action on climate change. His first official act was to sign the Kyoto Protocol.
And so it's with great honour that I present this instrument of ratification to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister.
But as John Howard noted, it was water restrictions that tuned urban Australians into climate change, and the link with drought was endlessly drawn, and for political ends.
Regrettably, Mr. Speaker, there'll be even less water in the future as a result of climate change.
Kevin Rudd elevated the argument to one about values. To argue against the government's position on climate change was not just to peddle bad policy, it was to be a bad person.
Climate change is the great moral challenge of our generation.
This moral bludgeon was used to club down opposition, but it also laid down a minefield from which it would be difficult to withdraw. And it's easy to forget that from 2007 until December 2009, the Coalition's policy was to price carbon, though it was staunchly resisted by some.
You talk about certainty. I'll give you certainty. You want certainty? How's no for certainty? No is a very certain word.
But it had a champion in Malcolm Turnbull.
I will not lead a party that is not as committed to effective action on climate change as I am.
Just hang on.
Another opposition leader was carried out in a body bag. The next once supported pricing carbon, but Tony Abbott found a much easier message to sell.
Is a great big tax.
And so events began to break the opposition's way. The Copenhagen Conference on Climate Change was a debacle. It began raining again on the East Coast, and the prediction of a very clever politician began to be realised.
My suspicion is that as time goes by, there will be increasing doubts.
In April last year, Kevin Rudd stepped on his own moral landmine.
The implementation of a carbon pollution reduction scheme in Australia will therefore be extended.
He proved that you can jettison a lot of policy in government, but you can't abandon principle. The Prime Minister's support collapsed and his party abandoned him. Labor was now so spooked by climate change, it dodged the issue whenever pressed.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
That turned out not to be true.
And I don't want to mince any words, that works effectively like a tax.
And whatever small amount of credit this government had left in the bank was spent. With dams now full on the eastern seaboard, the climate change surrogate, water, isn't an urgent concern. But living costs are. So Tony Abbott continues to bang his great big new tax drum.
Julia Gillard's carbon tax could cost jobs here in the heart of her own electorate.
And the government has some cause for blaming him for turning public sentiment.
Difficult reforms always run into entrenched debate, and they run into fear campaigns from opportunistic oppositions.
But it's Labor that largely mapped out the journey that led it to this abysmal low. Now it's selling the skeleton of a plan to a sceptical community, and the lack of detail is fueling uncertainty.
Putting a price on carbon is the right thing to do.
Right.
It's in our nation's interest.
And it's clearly in Julia Gillard's interest. It's also a fair bet that without political capital, she'll have to spend millions of real dollars to win popular support. She has little choice. because this time there is no turning back.
Political editor Chris Uhlmann.